Good morning, everyone. President-elect Biden unveiled his long-awaited COVID relief plan, and it's coming in at $1.9 trillion. Yes, it includes an additional $1,400 in stimulus checks, and yes, it's already getting pushback. Last night, in his announcement, Biden justified the price tag. Take a listen.
I know what I just described does not come cheaply, but failure to do so will cost us dearly. We will pay for that by making sure that everyone pays their fair share. Not punishing anybody.
So how's all this going down on Capitol Hill and on Wall Street? Bloomberg News editor-at-large Marty Schenker and Bloomberg News editor Joe Weisenthal, aka the Stalwart, on Twitter, join me now with the latest. Guys, thanks so much for being here. Marty, I want to start with you. The president-elect said pretty clearly that taxes are how we're going to pay for this. How are people reacting on the Hill?
Well, I mean, the key person who hasn't reacted so far is McConnell, the Senate leader, and I think that's forcing a lot of the legislators to kind of make their own take, and a lot of the responses are basically knee-jerk responses. No, we're not going to, state and local governments are a non-starter. No, a big increase in taxes is not going to happen. It'll be very interesting to see if Joe Biden's deal-making capabilities, which he has mentioned many times, comes into play here.
Yeah, it was surprising to see some of these knee-jerk reactions. We did see that Republicans are already pushing back, despite the fact that this does include something that Republicans and Democrats wanted: more money to Americans, direct payments. $350 billion for state and local governments. That's what the Democrats wanted. And there are also this $400 per week in supplementary unemployment benefits through September. How do these issues sort of show where the Republican Party is and where the Republican Party is confused about moving forward?
Well, actually, Marco Rubio tweeted last night that, Joe Biden knows the Senate. He knows this is too big a meal for us to digest. So he's suggesting that they take them in chunks. In other words, just pass the stimulus checks first. They can probably get that done pretty quickly and then move on to the other things in kind of segments.
Joe, I wanted to bring you in here when we talk about the idea of paying for this, because you've long talked about how the idea of the deficit is something that we don't really need to worry about here. Does it seem like Biden and his team are worried about the deficit?
No, and I think if you really look, this is where there's a clear difference between the Biden econ policy today versus the Obama econ policy coming out of the great financial crisis. That stimulus was much smaller. The Recovery Act was much smaller. And very early on, even when unemployment was quite elevated, you heard the Obama team, they fretted about the deficit. They were worried about the politics of letting the deficit get too big. We've had 10 years since then. Interest rates have already gone down massively. Inflation has been very mild. And I think that there are many economists within the sort of Democratic camp who have really changed their views on the dangers of deficits. And I think they see this as an opportunity that their best shot at enacting a positive agenda, maintaining popularity, is in leaning into growth, not trying to worry about the deficit now. You heard Biden talk, I think it was earlier this week, about the low interest rates, low inflation, a reason for deficit spending. And so I think, as you said, they will talk about taxes. They will talk about how they're going to pay for it. But it's clear, these are spending plans. They're not tax and spend plans in the traditional sense. The highlight, the centerpiece, is the spending.
What about when it comes to those direct payments? There has been some rare bipartisan support for direct payments to Americans. What did we learn in 2020 about the way that direct payments do help spur the economy and do help stimulate the economy? And what do you make of this idea of $1,400 adding up to $2,000? Because a lot of the chatter on Twitter last night was like, hey, wait a second, why don't we just make this $2,000 instead of trying to add to the $600 that was passed a few weeks ago?
Yeah, there's some question about whether that 2,000 number was ever going to be additive or the cumulative. But look, I think the thing that a lot of people really learned in 2020 is that direct payments to households, particularly if they go to households that aren't making a ton of money, they will get spent. That has a very powerful stimulative effect. I mean, you compare that to, say, the Trump tax cuts, which a lot of people got tax cuts, but the majority did go to higher income earners because people with higher incomes pay most of the taxes. It did not have a particularly strong effect on growth. When you look at the power of the direct checks that we saw in 2020, you already see just this morning economists continue to ratchet up their growth forecast for 2021 because of the clear effects that direct payments can have.
Marty, are there clear winners and losers when it comes to what Biden unveiled last night?
Sure there are. I mean, and if in fact the direct payments do get approved and they're targeted to the people who need that most, then clearly millions and millions of Americans who are in desperate conditions are going to benefit from this considerably. And that's going to help the economy, and that raises all boats.
What about losers here? Because we did have some Republicans already pushing back, saying, you know, Main Street's scratching their head, and businesses are wondering about relief, which I found surprising because this seems to have a lot of benefits for Main Street and for business too.
Well, you know, it's really hard to identify real losers when you're spending almost $2 trillion into the economy.
It's a lot of money.
It's a lot of money. And, you know, if there ever is a tax offset to this, then the wealthiest Americans would probably stand to lose. But as Joe mentioned, whether or not we really do get those tax increases is really up in the air.
I think one thing that was really notable was this raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. We have seen Amazon do that for its employees across the board. And in fact, the federal minimum wage has not gone up in years. It's a weird kind of thing politically, though, Marty, because we saw Florida, for example, back in November, go for President Trump, but also approve a slow increase of the minimum wage in the state, too. So it's like, politically, what is $15 minimum wage, which has traditionally been aligned with progressives?
There are many, many states whose minimum wages are in single digits still, who feel that small businesses, which are the lifeblood of many, for instance, rural southern communities and in suburban area and rural areas around the country, think that small businesses, when they're reeling as it is, if they're forced to pay $15 an hour, are never going to be able to recover. So there is a political tint to this, but there's a real economic underpinning as well.
Joe, big banks right now are kicking off earnings season.
Yeah.
How are the markets reacting to what was unveiled last night?
Financials have really been on a tear even before going into these earnings. And I think there is perhaps an argument that this is one of the best environments for big banks in a while. We see a lot of deal activity, a lot of capital markets activity, IPOs. We also have a situation in which if we really do get sustained fiscal stimulus, we could see lots of loan growth, credit growth. Perhaps we've seen rates increase at the long end, so that also helps banks. Right now, there is a bit of a moment. Also, you know, unemployment is much lower than the banks. Right now, unemployment is much lower than the banks thought it would be back in March and April. So a lot of them set aside money expecting huge losses on their credit portfolio that they're going to be able to unlock because things aren't so bad. So I think the environment right now is much better for banks than they would have guessed a year ago, maybe even pre-crisis.
Okay, well, a lot happened overnight. I want to end with Marty with the news that the president might spend his might spend the next few years holed up at Mar-a-Lago or in Florida. So I want to do some role playing here, Marty. Imagine that you're a Mar-a-Lago resort resident. You're waking up this morning to the news that very soon you'll have a new permanent neighbor who was the former president of the United States. What are you thinking?
Oh, there goes the neighborhood.
There goes the neighborhood. Well, we're happy to have the two of you guys in the neighborhood today.
Thank you.
That's Bloomberg's Marty Shanker and Joe Weisenthal. Thanks so much for your time.